Hey, okay, so Brodsky. I warned you this poem was tough, but I think it's really rich to get into. So I've been thinking about how best to approach this on my end. I mean, this is something that it's very difficult to give a lecture on this entire poem. One, I want you guys to do some of the work yourselves. Two, this is the sort of thing that if you look at our original syllabus, we were going to spend 3 or 4 different class periods with me kind of guiding through a discussion, and we could quote, and we could all quote together, and etc., etc. The trouble is, I feel like getting everybody together for some kind of Zoom call at the same time. I don't know how people's internet are. I don't know what people's lives are like. Everything's a mess. So, I think what I'm going to do is give you an example of the sort of analysis that I'm thinking about. Now, when you go to write a journal entry about this, there's no possible way you're going to be able to treat this entire poem, right? So first of all, you're going to have to pick an aspect or aspects of it to focus on, right? To be able to, pull a quote, analyze it, etc., pull a couple of quotes, do that kind of more useful in-depth thinking. You're not going to be able to treat everything in this poem. And so partly I assume that people will tend to go for things that they talked about in their groups, right? That they sort of examined and detailed. But it's also important to find connections elsewhere in the poem. So I think what I'm going to do is try to do an example of this using the first 3 cantos, right? And sort of thinking about elements of characterization, and elements of symbolism, and elements of theme. All right? So, as far as characterization goes, obviously you have Gorbanov and Gorchakov. And as I warned you, it can sometimes be difficult when you're new to this poem. Who's talking? What are they talking about? Blah, blah. I suggested that you read it aloud, that you read it with people, to sort of get the back and forth. But if we think carefully, once we sort of sort out who is talking when, they talk about very different things, and particularly when we look at their dreams. So, in the first canto, if we think about what they are dreaming about, Gorbanov dreams about these very abstract and symbolic things, his mushrooms, right? So, what did you dream of this time? Mushrooms mostly. Mushrooms again, right? And what are those mushrooms about? Freud comes up. Now remember, I mentioned that for Soviet psychiatry, Freud is forbidden. Freud is, we are materialists. We don't do Freud. But Freud comes up again and again. And of course, Freud is all about dream symbolism, right? And so Gorbanov, right away then, is associated with Freud, is associated with dream symbolism, is set opposed to, counter to this materialist Marxist-Leninist world, right? So, about these mushrooms. He says, they're just like islands. Mushrooms even sprout like little islands, and the same can stand for streets and alleys, dead ends, words throughout. Our lives we speak in spurts, or tend to, and between the spurts, like silence all about, is grass. But you can touch them with your hand, and so they have unbounded rights, and what sustains the solid ground on which I stand seems as unsteady as a rocking float the Nevis currents bear away from land. So, 1, again, deeply symbolic. 2, we have these sets of association. The mushrooms are like islands. They're also like spurts of words, so the idea of communication comes up. You have the mushroom surrounded by grass. It's compared to the island surrounded by water. It's compared to the speech act surrounded by silence. Okay, there's a set of associations. Later, in Canto 2, we return to this. Right? Your chanterelles are hazards to the sane. Beware, they're far from harmless, Gorbanov. How much importance do you give to them? As much as I give love. And what is love? The end to loneliness, the very end. It's being able once to stand above the bed end by just bending over in the silence with your hands, brow, breath, touch life. What are you staring at? The stars, the lane, the opposite of empty narrative. So now the other association with the mushrooms is love, right? And what is this love? The opposite of empty narrative, which must be a conversation, right? Which must be something meaningful, communication. So now here's another set of symbolic associations, right? And if we think towards the end of the poem, I mean, this is the sort of thing that would come up on the discussion board. So if somebody brought up these things from Cantos 1 and 2, folks from the end of the poem could talk about the fact that he stops dreaming about mushrooms. He dreams about the sea. Now remember, we've got mushrooms surrounded by grass. We've got islands surrounded by water. We've got speech acts surrounded by silence. And all of this is about love, whether it's monologue or dialogue, right? And by the end of the poem, he says he only dreams of the sea, right? So we've made this move from speech to silence, right? From love to something else, right? And so that's the sort of thing to draw on from later in the poem. We can contrast his dreams, these deeply symbolic dreams, with what Gorchakov says he dreams about. So, in Leningrad, we have so many dreams, but mushroom clearly is the one you're wedded to. And what are all you Leningraders dreaming then? Well, it depends. Of concerts forested, with bows, of avenues and alleys, men, just faces, all in all they're fragmented. The Neva, bridges, or a page I can discern, although the nurse collects come bedtime all our specs without my glasses on. He goes on bullfinches, leaping puddles, things. And Gorbanov even says these are just things. And it's true. Gorbanov is dreaming in these deeply abstract symbols, and Gorchakov is dreaming of things, the material world. So we're back to this idea again that comes from Soviet psychiatry, that comes from Marxism-Leninism as an ideology, where we are opposing materialism and idealism. The material world, right? The world of things, objects, events, relations, with ideas, with the mind, with consciousness. And so remember that for a Marxist-Leninist, the material world conditions consciousness. And at one point in this poem, he even says, I take that left to right, by which he means he'd reverse it. Consciousness conditions the world, right? And so that kind of idealism, perhaps a hazard to the sane. The things that we dream about then begin to form the real world. And the real world, of course, if you are subjected to that level of abstraction, we do drift a little dangerously far afield, right? On the other hand, in the absence of this kind of consciousness, this kind of idea, these kinds of abstract symbols, we're left with something very barren, right? Something that is devoid of any kind of deep meaning, right? Something that is, doesn't really have much hermeneutic depth. It's not interpretable in the same way. And so, on one hand, Gorbanov and Gorchakov, as characters, one is sort of assigned this material consciousness, right? One is sort of assigned this idealistic consciousness as personality elements. But then, in a way, in the sort of symbolic level of the poem, they're assigned those things, right? Materialism and idealism. The physical world versus consciousness, right? And so the farther they move apart, you'll notice that the more and more disrupted things become in the poem, to the point where Gorbanov spirals out and away by the end of the poem. And so there's a suggestion that one of these is not better than the other. We actually need an interlocution between the two. We need a dialogue. And so if we think about Canto 3, Canto 3 is oftentimes, I have students point to the idea that Gorbanov is the only character in the poem, and that we see evidence of that kind of, say, schizophrenia here, a kind of literally split identity in Canto 3, and that makes sense. And I said, I think that's a reasonable reading of the poem. Scholars have had it. It's not one that I necessarily share, but nevertheless, if we look at Canto 3, Gorbanov in the night, he's talking to himself, sort of addressing God. We get some literal background on the character. I dream of chanterelles, but never dream now of my wife. As fabric tears where thinnest. So one thing we find out about him as a matter of the plot of this poem is that he had a wife. He loved her. She wanted to leave. He got her pregnant on purpose to make her stay. You know, he admits that this was a bum thing to do. Now, of course, he's in a mental institution. This relationship is not necessarily enduring that. And this harkens a little bit to Brodsky's own situation. You know, I told you last week that he checks himself into a mental hospital over a suicide attempt and over this kind of depression that happens because of a woman, right? So he's not exactly in the same situation, but this, right, this sort of, you can see a bit of biography here. He talks about, besides I'm contradicted by its voice, by its sense, that voice, consistent, hollow, sure. Whose voice isn't, can't be my wife's, and since persistently the supernatural world stays silent as my wife, it can't be saints. This idea of the other voice, the interlocutor, the dialogue, right? My mind divides the way a microbe splits, and in the silence multiplies forever. So here is this idea of the split personality that people draw on. Yes, two of us before the altar inasmuch. You know, so we're back to thinking about the real plot situation with the wife. But now we go to, she left, I am possessed by, I possess myself. I am possessed by myself, I possess myself, well, maybe I should call for Gorchakov, hey Gorchakov! Right, and so he goes to Gorchakov, right? And so, you know, one understanding of this is then that Gorchakov is just an element of his personality. Another understanding is that the poem symbolically understands Gorchakov as one half of these sets of oppositions. The Gorbanov is the other half, and they need each other, right? In the symbolic sense, even though plot-wise they're two different people. Hey, Gorchakov, I guess, the bed bell's wrong, but is it, after all, so senseless for one pair of vying lips, especially without a music hall to sing as two? I watch them as they press, together, syllable by syllable. I am a circle cleaved. Thus, more or less, we're magnets, horseshoe-shaped, identical. I am a circle cleaved, right? And so this, again, speaks to this idea of the binary, the opposition, but not just an opposition, but also two halves of a whole, right? Things that need to go together. Night, night, my lips performing a duet. You think that it's too good for you. I say that there's a special coziness in it. It is a contradiction, right? And so, you know, as a matter of diction here, we're bringing up contradictions, we're bringing up these kinds of halves and wholes. Yes, but they are close, about almost a family one bit, the lips, right? So again, these two halves of a circle, right? The upper lip is like a groom to wit, the lower lip is like his fiancée, recalling that episode again, but that which splits in two will surely split into 200 just as easily. And so this idea that once you have division between people in the mind, however we're taking it, right, things fall apart. And that happens in this poem. Again, if we think back towards the end of the poem, then in the late cantos, once things begin to divide, once they are separated, all things fall apart, right? And we see that happen in the poem. Despair divides my soul like wood in two, and yet it's not that I remain beside it tete-a-tete. Two-souledness would seem atheistic, but it's not the flame that logs require, the inverse makes it hot. Back to the microbes, etc., etc. So again, we're collecting these series of images, and there's many more. In Canto 2, we get our first mention of astrology, and that's certainly something that could be pursued, right? And again, that's an example of the difference between Gorbanov and Gorchakov's perspective, this idea of materialism versus idealism, you know, conditions versus consciousness. So when he says in Canto 2, you know, what are you looking at? The starry fields, what's this? Another Galileo, doubtlessly. With the departure of Aquarius around the 20th of February, we see Pisces in ascendancy, the fish, sign pledging the rivers will again run free. And what about the earth? The earth? Well, yes. What's down below? That alley edged with trees. You know what, Gorbanov? Your case is sad. A neo-Newton come analysand. Another reference to Freud. They go through this, he's cold, I'm full of doubt. I want a telescope, right? He doesn't believe in his astrology, right? He's like, I just see the lane below. We need a telescope. This sort of, okay, fine, science, let's see the stars, blah, 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 which is very different, of course, from the abstraction and the symbolism of astrology. So again, that can go into the pile of associations where these men differ, but they are also sort of halves of the whole. They're communicating, but they're missing each other. And we can wonder then about where astrology and the stars fit in with mushrooms and the sea, and love, and microbes and division. So my point in all of this is that you can approach this in a couple of ways. One here, in what I've discussed, we've picked a kind of formal element of the story, characterization, and we can run through the ways the characters are characterized. And one of the ways they are characterized is by their dreams. Later, they're characterized by their actions in relation to the doctors, in relation to each other, right? And so we can think in those formal senses: characterization, setting, structure. And the structure of this poem is rigorous. I mean, if you really think about, pick any canto, your chanterelles are hazards to the sane. Beware they're far from harmless, Gorbanov. How much importance do you give to them? As much as I give love. And what is love? The end to loneliness, the very end? It's being able once to stand above. The bed end by just bending over in. The silence with your hands, brow, breath, touch life. What are you staring at? The stars, the lane? The opposite of empty narrative. The foot and the meter, I mean, it's hard to read for that when you're reading for meaning, but if you take the effort to do it, there's the rhyme pattern, the foot, the meter, everything is structured out incredibly rigorously. So we can think in terms of structure and what that lends to this poem in terms of its theme. We can think about theme, another formal element. What are the themes of this poem? Obviously something to do with love, something to do with dialogue. There's also a critique of the system itself. The two cantos, Gorchakov selling Gorbanov out to the doctors, Gorbanov being interrogated by the doctors who are just looking for political reasons to commit him and making up absurdities based on Marxist-Leninist ideology. So that's a thing we can do. We can also, as I said, begin to pick apart symbolism, to think in terms of what all these objects mean, right? The starry fields, the mushrooms, the sea, the food they keep eating, microbes. Later on we get wood fires, plates, circles, the circumference is 0, clocks come into play. You could, if you wanted to as an approach, pick one of these symbolic images or objects from the poem and trace it through the poem and sort of see when it gets referenced, how it's used when it's referenced, the totality of those references, what they add up to. That's certainly a way to go. But my point being that we see, if we connect cantos 1, 2, and 3, we can start constructing evidence for what the characterization is like, how the characters relate, what the symbols are, how those symbols eventually come to be used, and what larger themes are. This idea, that he's dealing with, and this is going to be a little tougher for you to go off of, but these ideas that are prevalent in Russian or in Soviet society, I can't overemphasize how every single aspect of Soviet society is ideological, is tinged by this ideology. And so even in this, there's this theme where we are debating these Soviet ideological points, these ideas of materialism and consciousness, Marxism, Leninism's ideas about how consciousness arises, and a debate about that. And if you think in that term, if you think about Marxist-Leninist ideology regarding the mind, then you can go through the poem that way and sort of see where these contradictions between materialism and idealism come up and how they're handled with, and what Brodsky seems to be saying about that. That's one of the themes of the poem. I think a theme is love. I think a theme is dialogue, is division, and therefore, of course, it's opposite unity, right? And what the unity is between things that appear to be opposites, right? Like islands in the sea. And speech itself, dialogue, this discussion where things fall apart when Gorbanov falls silent, right? And Gorchakov is left in silence. Partly through his own actions, right? He sells him out in this sort of the more pragmatic realm of the poem, this thinking through of the corruption of the Soviet psychiatric system. So, yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot. And what I'd like to see on the discussion boards, and I'll start a couple threads, is, make some starting posts based on what you're interested in. Like if you're really interested in the symbolism of, astrology in the poem or something, or if you're really interested in the interactions with the doctors and what they're sort of indicating about Soviet society. I remember thinking back to what Boris Segal told us about all of that. And then my hope is that, if you were assigned Canto 2, somebody else would then jump in from, Canto 3 and be like, oh, well, these things kind of go together. We track the mushrooms from Canto 1 to Canto 2. And we track the stars from Canto 2 to Canto whatever. I can't remember off the top of my head. There's several places, right? And to sort of collaborate along those lines. And try to piece together, maybe not an understanding of everything in this poem. I think that would be, that's somebody's dissertation. But the idea that by tracking one of these sets of ideas, by the time we get to the end of the poem, we have a sense of at least one of the things that Brodsky wanted to accomplish, right? Whatever line you decide to trace. So, and then that's what your journal entry will be. So, that's the idea. And if you have questions, treat my email inbox like office hours. All right. Good luck.